You are listening to Business Talk podcast. I'm Deepak, bringing you meaningful conversations from the world of business and beyond. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Arvind Sahay, Director and Professor of Marketing and International Business at the Management Development Institute, Gurgaon, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Before joining MDI Gurgaon, Professor Sahay was a distinguished faculty member at the Indian Institute of Management Ahmedabad and previously at London Business School, following his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Sahay's teaching and research interests span marketing strategy, pricing, consumer neuroscience, brand management, international trade, and high-tech marketing. He has taught core and elective courses across PGP, PGPX, and executive education programs, consistently receiving top teaching rankings, averaging 9/10. He has designed and delivered executive education programs across diverse areas, including pricing, fintech, marketing neuroscience, and behavioral science. Dr. Sahay has authored 34 international peer-reviewed journal articles, 65 business cases, and over 50 popular pieces in leading business publications. His recent research includes work on brand preference, consumer reaction to pricing strategies, and the behavioral dimensions of gold consumption in India. A notable project involved in a nationwide randomized control trial for FSSAI published in Food Quality and Preferences in 2023. His second best-selling book, Brands and the Brain, was released in April 2022. A recipient of multiple awards, including the University of Texas Outstanding Dissertation Award, London Business School's Innovation in Teaching Award, and the Devang Mehta Best Marketing Teacher Award. Professor Sahay has also been recognized by Thinkers50 India. Dr. Sahay, recipient of the Philip Morris Best Case Award at IIMA, has held key leadership roles, including Dean Alumni and External Relations, where he led major fundraising and strategic initiatives like the NSE Centre for Behavioral Science and India Gold Policy Center. With 35 years of boardroom experience across listed and unlisted firms, he also enjoys trekking, badminton, golf, and studying constitutional law. In this episode, Professor Sahay shares valuable insights from his research, tariffs, trade, and tension, how global firms should rethink marketing and exports. So, without further delay, let's welcome Professor Arvind Sahay to the podcast. Dr. Sahay, thank you for joining us today and for graciously accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Deepak, for inviting me. It's always a wonderful experience to have a chat with you.
Thank you. Professor Sahay, to begin, could you shed some light on how recent changes in global tariff and trade policies are influencing the marketing and export strategies of multinational companies?
So, Deepak, before I begin, let's try and understand what is happening just now and why it is happening, and therefore that should determine how we need to respond. A key fact that we have to remember is that over the last 80 years or so, the average tariff levels have gone down from around 30% in 1948 to less than 5% globally across the world in 2020. So almost down from 30 to 5% means, you've decreased it by almost 80%. But the burden of that decrease has been largely on one country or maybe a few countries. Primarily, the reductions have been the most by the United States of America. How has that happened? That has happened because post-World War II, the Americans led the establishment of a new world order. And one dimension of this new world order was the establishment of a rules-based trading system. So the first avatar of this rules-based trading system was the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which started after the Second World War, and there were many rounds of that, one up to the mid-80s, after which the World Trade Organization was established with the purpose that the rules-based trading order would continue to decrease tariffs, to make international trade free and fair across different countries. The underlying premise, of course, being the theory of comparative and absolute advantage, that it makes sense to trade because then consumers are better off, right? That was the underlying premise. But over time, what happened is that because the larger proportion of the responsibility of driving this process was resting with America. So America ended up as the consumer of the last resort. And the rest of the world started to export their way to growth by exporting to America. And we know the story. First, it was Japan, then South Korea, then China, to some extent Taiwan, and now it could be India to a certain extent. And all of these guys depended on a tariff regime in the US, which was fairly low. The simultaneous occurrence or simultaneous events which are occurring is that companies are globalizing and going and to all these different countries, and they are dividing their supply chain across these countries. Why are companies going there, and especially American companies, but to some extent European also? Because they are driven by a financial logic which says that I want to maximize by return on assets. So what do you do to maximize return on assets? You outsource. So your asset number goes down. So for the same profit, your asset returns go up. So this combination of free trade, so to say, based on reduction in tariffs, and the splitting of the value chain across countries, especially to countries trying to take advantage of these low tariffs, has led to a situation where all manufacturing moved out of the States, well, most of it anyway, and also to a certain extent from Europe, and got concentrated in East Asia. It's no accident that China, South Korea, Japan are so much stronger in manufacturing, and relatively the Americans and many Europeans, Germany being one exception perhaps to a limited extent, have lost their manufacturing capacity. So when this has happened, clearly strategically at some point something had to give, and once the Chinese reached a certain scale, at $18 trillion, their economy is now two-thirds the size of the Americans. And now they're seriously growing as a global power. So the geopolitics changed from a situation where America was a clear military, political, economic, cultural leader. So many different dimensions, you are the leader. Suddenly, on an economic comparative scale, you are no longer an undisputed leader. Suddenly, your navy is no longer the largest. So you start to feel insecure, which is what the Americans are feeling. And so therefore, now, how do I preserve my power? How do you preserve the power? You preserve it by increasing tariffs, by letting people know that it's no longer going to be that easy to export your way into the States and grow while removing all manufacturing from the US. So that is the logic of what we are seeing today. While one may not like the style in which it is delivered from the American administration, the underlying logic is quite strong. Unfortunately, it comes at a time when the realignment of geopolitical power is now also playing simultaneously into this whole business of tariffs and the change in trade, and also the supply chain. The supply chain needs to simultaneously change if one wants to make a difference. So if you look at this as the backdrop, therefore, if you're a multinational company, what are really your options? Let's say you're an American multinational like Apple. You own the intellectual property. You do the design in Cupertino, California. But the manufacturing happens almost completely in China. The microprocessor design may have been made in Cupertino, but it's manufactured in TSMC in Taiwan. And with the increased geopolitical tensions and the tariffing, Apple has moved to realign the supply chain from Taiwan and from China to India. But then you start hearing comments like Mr. Tim Cook, if you are manufacturing for America in India, that's not on. You can manufacture for India in India, but not for the US in India. And so automatically, a lot of the large American companies who worked on the basis of a supply chain which was fragmented and around the world, and which worked on the premise that there is stability in the geopolitical landscape, that premise has simply gone out of the window. That basic assumption now no longer holds. So it's not just Apple, it's the BMWs of the world, it is the telecom companies of the world, it is the automotive companies of the world, it is the semiconductor manufacturing companies of the world. All manufacturing has now suddenly come under stress because of this. Now, the very interesting thing is, for India, this is both a huge opportunity and a huge threat. Why is it a huge opportunity and a huge threat? If you look at the export basket of India, our exports are half goods and half services. Last year, we exported around $750 billion worth of goods and services. About $400 billion was goods and $350 billion was services. The services part can be divided into information technology services. It can also, you can look at tourism, you can look at global capability centers, and the whole bunch. And services normally have not been subject to tarification, and services normally do not come under the ambit of domestic manufacturing, right? So long as India can continue to build on the services and take advantage of some of the bilateral deals which are happening, India should be okay. So, which brings us to what multinational companies should do. So, what should I be doing? Step one, I should be following very, very closely what are these bilateral deals which are happening. So, India has concluded a bilateral deal with the United Kingdom, right? So, what was the deal with the United Kingdom? The United Kingdom essentially is a free trade agreement which stops the tariffs between United Kingdom and India on many different items. So, for example, on cotton, yarn, fabric, and apparel, the UK is going to drop its tariffs to almost zero. If India signs this bilateral deal with the UK, sorry, it has already signed the deal with the UK. That means now there is an opportunity for us to take up the space for textile exports, especially apparel exports, into the UK, which is primarily led by China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh just now. We are number 4 there. 40% of the UK apparel imports come from China. India is only around 5%. Bangladesh is twice the amount that we export. Same in the US. The China exports $170 billion worth of apparel to the US. Bangladesh is at around $35 billion. We are at $17 billion, half of Bangladesh. But if we also sign an agreement with the United States, apart from United Kingdom, suddenly you have a huge opportunity for companies in India, the Welspuns, the Vardhaman Textiles. They can also get into apparel and they can expand the level of exports that they have. So there are particular sectors where companies can actually benefit a lot. Indian companies in particular can benefit a lot. Textiles is definitely one. Automotives is another. In automotives, India is already a fairly large exporter of two-wheelers. We can do even better. It's interesting, we hear a lot in the press that we are going to decrease the tariff on an automobile like Harley Davidson bikes. If we decrease the tariff on the Harley Davidson bikes, it really doesn't make much of a difference in the overall balance of payments for us. But if in return we are able to send mobiles or other goods into the US, then we will be better off. So the thing to see, it's almost by industry, automotive, textiles, semiconductors. These are some areas where India could actually benefit a lot. The one place where we need to be a little careful is in agriculture. So let's see how that goes, because we still have a very large dependency in terms of employment in the agri sector. Almost 35% of our population is directly still engaged in agriculture. The dairy industry also. So those are sectors where we need to be careful. So in terms of what companies should be doing, A, they should be following the negotiations very carefully to see what is going to emerge as the final outcome. In fact, I would go one step further and I would say that they should be actively engaged in the process of the negotiations. They should be helping the government with data information so that the government of India is able to negotiate the best deals for the country in different industry areas. The second thing that they should be doing is they should be looking at their supply chains very carefully. Suppose you're an electrical vehicle manufacturer in India today, and you're making motors which use these rare earth magnets. And China has temporarily put a stop to the export of these rare earth magnets. Again, geopolitics affecting trade, which never used to be the case earlier. Well, at least not for the last 80 years. So what are your options as a manufacturer of electric two-wheelers? Let's say you're a motorcycle company based out of Ahmedabad. There is one that is based out of Ahmedabad. You want those magnets, but China is not going to export those magnets. But China does export the magnets as part of a motor, electric motor. But motor is your design, your own design. You don't want to give it to them. So you will need to negotiate with the Chinese exporter of the magnet that here is our motor. You fit the magnet and give it to us as a motor rather than as just the magnet, because it's the export of the magnet which is being restricted, not of the motor which contains the magnet. Of course, there will be some negotiation because the Chinese may end up wanting the intellectual property behind the motor, which has been designed here in India. So one has to be careful in how one negotiates with the Chinese supplier to get that. So item two on the to-do list would be to go with your industry components, which are part of the supply chain in other countries where there are now restrictions because of geopolitical issues, and negotiate very carefully so that you're able to get the components that you want without having to part with your intellectual property. And the third thing that one needs to do is to, of course, try and start manufacturing locally as much as is possible. Now, this is where the catch is, right? There are some things that you can probably start manufacturing relatively quickly. Apparel. If the right policy framework were in place, India could double its exports or even triple its exports of apparel within 3 years. It's possible. On the other hand, automotive, it might take another 6 or 7 years, even if you started today. Active pharmaceutical ingredients. We've had a policy for the last 3 years, but we're still not doing that well. Our dependency on active pharmaceutical ingredients has only come down from 90% to 70%. As a country, if we want to be safe, then we need to be probably at 30 or 40% dependency on bulk drugs from China. And same applies to the US also. So I sometimes wonder, with all this fire and brimstone that we hear from the US, do they actually understand? I'm sure they do at some level, maybe not at the level of the president, that it is not going to happen overnight. But yes, the process has begun of realignment. And for companies, it is going to be a fairly challenging time over the next 2 to 4 years as the supply chains realign, as the new normal becomes a somewhat higher level of tariff than has been the case for the last few years, when the average tariffs came down to 5%, with the US at close to zero in most cases. So the US will probably go up to 10 or 20%, maybe even 25%. Consumers will suffer a little. So that's one part of the process that firms will need to go through as they start rethinking their export and supply chain strategy. The export and supply chain are very closely linked, right? What you can export is a function of how you are, how your supply chain is being set up and used across different geographies. In terms of marketing, it will follow the geopolitics and the realignment of the supply chain. The one thing which will continue to increase in importance, especially so far as developed Western countries are concerned, is that the consumer is increasingly looking for products which have ESG behind them, environment, sustainability, and governance. So if I am sending them something, textiles or automotive, I better make sure that what has been manufactured by me has the relevant good labor practices, good environment practices, sustainability practices, and so on. And for the next 1.5 years at least, November 2026, there is going to be volatility, there is going to be uncertainty, and we simply have to work with that. Right now, we have a fairly large-scale war going on between Israel and Iran. That has affected tourism and some supply chains. The Russia-Ukraine war has affected some supply chains. Ukraine is a very large supplier of fiber, which is used in roofing, for example. So that has affected the prices of roofing manufacturers here in India, some of which is sold locally, but some of it also is exported. Similarly, if there were further conflicts, armed conflicts, which arise out of what is going on just now, then you can expect more disruptions. So let me pause there and see if you have any questions or comments before we go further.
Professor Sahay, how do Indian industries pursue this trade tension? And what impact, if any, have they had on India's export performance? If you could shed some lights on the findings and data.
So if you look at the Indian export landscape between 2019-20 and today, our goods exports have gone up from around $330 billion to about $410 billion. Our services export have gone up from 280 to around close to $350 billion. Our largest export is petroleum and refined products, interestingly. Our largest import is also crude oil, right? This 23-24, for which we have the full year's data, our crude oil imports were $120 billion, and we exported $70 billion worth of refined petroleum products. Similarly, gems and jewelry is our largest import and our second largest export as well. We also import a fair amount of electrical machinery and equipment. But we export large amounts of engineering goods. Pharma, of course, is a large export for us, $30 billion worth of exports. Textile and apparel is a large export for us, $25 billion worth of export. Now, if you look at each one of these, right, and examine the companies which are doing it. So petroleum refined product exports, it's a combination, mostly private sector, but a few public sector companies. We have built up the refining capacity in our country. So our refining capacity is now in excess of 270 to 80 million tons, whereas our consumption is less than 4.8 million barrels per day. So that would be around 230 to 40 million tons. So the good news is that we are not going to be too affected on our largest export just now because people need refined oil. The Americans can make a noise if we import a lot from Russia or from Iran, but our imports from Iran are somewhat limited. And Russia as a country, the Americans need to make up their mind whether Russia is a friend or an enemy. So till they make up their mind, we can continue to import a reasonably large amount, and we don't have to pay hard currency to import from there. Jewelry and precious stones, the diamond industry is in trouble, deep trouble, because you may be aware that lab-grown diamonds have now started getting some scale. And the price differential between lab-grown diamonds and natural diamonds is quite large. For the same 1 carat stone that you might get for price X, the lab-grown diamond might be available for 0.3x. So, 70% lower price. And, it looks pretty much the same. You can barely make out the difference, even if you're an expert. You know, there are companies, for example, like SRK Exports based out of Surat, very large exporter out of India. And they have like a 24-point check for different parameters on which to judge a diamond. On that 24-point check, a lab-grown diamond can be, pretty similar. And for the retail buyer, you and me, very difficult to make out the difference. And if it is certified by reasonably well-known people that the lab-grown diamond is genuine, satisfies all the requirements, it has the color, cut, caratage, and the clarity that is required, the 4 Cs that are required in diamonds, then the buyer will buy, and it is happening. The natural diamond is kind of collapsing. So that has implications for Indian export. Last year, for example, we exported 23-24, we exported around $50 billion worth of exports. That is under stress. Will the tariffs make a difference in this sector? Probably not. The others are organic chemicals and pharmaceuticals. In pharmaceuticals, we need to be careful. It's a large growing industry and export sector for India. $30 billion is a fair amount. Almost 8% of our total exports can grow to 12, 14, 15%. And if the tariffs were increased, then we would have a problem, even though the likelihood of the increase being major is somewhat less. Already, the generics that we export to the US are priced at a lot less than equivalent medicines, sometimes up to 80% less than the branded patented version that goes off patent. So it's already a reasonable price, but there are hardly any tariffs, and the US might decide tomorrow that, I'm going to impose 10% tariff. So that will cause a problem. We need to be careful. But the good news again over there is that the number of options before the US to get those branded generics from elsewhere in the world are relatively less. The Chinese still don't have a same level of presence in formulations. They're strong in APIs, but not in formulations. So we need to be careful at the back end so that we have enough of our own APIs. Textiles and apparel, we already talked about the opportunity for India. $17 billion worth of exports to the US could very easily go to twice or thrice if the US slaps the tariffs that it says it is going to. July 9th is supposed to be the date on which we will know, even though there are reports now which suggest that that date has been extended. So we will have to wait and see. My sense is that we should be able to have some kind of an agreement with the US also, in addition to the UK. There are talks which are going on with the European Union as well. That's our also one of the largest trade partners. So if you look at our trade partners, for us, the 5 largest places in terms of imports are China, USA, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Mexico. And we export the most to the USA, United Arab Emirates, China, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So for these countries, our vulnerability is probably the highest with the US and China. And with the Chinese, because we are importing $200 billion and we are only exporting around $50 billion, so we have a very large deficit. So the issue is not so much going to be impacting us from the Chinese perspective as the American perspective, which is why it is so important for us to get that deal. As the Americans say, let's make that deal, which is why we are working very hard to get that deal, and we must get that deal. My sense is that we will get that deal. The other parts are relatively less important. The good news, I think, is that because we have been focusing on domestic manufacturing now for a while, this whole business of Atmanirbhar Bharat that our Prime Minister has been saying for a while now, that is leading to some very interesting new things which are happening. So defense exports, for example, in the last 5 years, they have tripled from $500 million to more than $1.5 billion, actually closer to $2 billion in the last full year. And it will continue to increase even more now that some of our domestically produced arms products, the Akash Tir and BrahMos, etc., have proved themselves. There is demand for that, and there is new capacity which has been created. Some capacity has just now come up in Lucknow. The Chief Minister, Mr. Yogi Adityanath, inaugurated it the other day. That should help us grow. But these are small base on which to grow. $1.5 billion in an export basket of $400 billion is a small number. It will take us time. So that's why it's so important for us to protect what we already have. And that is why getting the trade deal done with the US and the European Union is so important. The good news in one way is that our services exports are continuing to expand. If you look at our service export basket, the largest component comes from information technology and information services. Then you have the global capability centers. Then you have tourism. You have consulting, and so on. So the global capability centers are already around $30 billion. They will expand further. Every other day, some new company is setting up its GCC here in India. It's essentially service export. The IT sector will have some challenges with AI coming in. So if you look at the top five software companies out of India, TCS, Infosys, Wipro, HCL Tech, and Tech Mahindra, uh, their growth has slowed down in the last 4 5 years. TCS, of course, is the worst affected in terms of the growth. But the industry as a whole is no longer growing as it was. So they're in a transition phase. The good news is that companies like Accenture and Cognizant and IBM, which are also competitors after a fashion for these guys, they're also going through a similar transition. So whoever makes that transition more quickly will be able to provide the services to the US, to Europe, and other places. One very interesting implication and outcome that one can see for India as a country is that India has probably got the largest number of work permit holders in the United States. Every year, out of the H-1B visas, which are all the H-1B visas which are given, the Indians are the largest number. The quota is 65,000 plus 20,000 for STEM and specialized professorial level or academic kind of appointments. So 85,000 H-1B visas legally yearly. And out of that, a vast majority is Indians. The number of Indian students in the US also is large. Last year, out of the million odd students which went to the US, around 330,000 students were Indians. So this is essentially a service export that the US is doing to India. That is going to fall because now increasingly students in the US are not very sure as to what is going to happen after they complete their students or even their studies, or even while they are students, their visa might get revoked if just because they get a speeding ticket or something. Because when things go this way, the law enforcers start to act arbitrarily, which is happening as we see. Um, so I see two things happening. One is that the number of students who are going to the US will come down drastically. They will stay here in India. Two, of the students who are there already, many of them will come back to India after their studies are over, even while their studies are going on. And that should give a very large bump up to the capacity of India to produce many different things. And this whole business of Atmanirbhar Bharat and being able to produce stuff in India should get a huge boost because of suddenly a larger number of skilled manpower being available, which would not have been the case earlier, because this large number cannot be absorbed at one go by other countries, Germany, France, UK. They cannot absorb that number. They are trying, but they cannot absorb that number. And so I think willy-nilly there will be an increase in our own capacity to manufacture, to produce services and export services. So my sense is that this geopolitical storm should help India relative to other countries. We are probably going to be better off, and it shows in the GDP growth numbers. It shows in the growth of exports and imports. Of course, vulnerability is also going to be higher because you never know. One fine day there is another armed conflict between India and its friendly neighbor, or some other conflict erupts in another part of Asia or Europe, which causes further supply chain disruptions. Net, one of the things which is going to happen is that the growth of trade will become less at an aggregate level. There will be parts which will grow faster for India specifically. And I looked at some of the sectors. Textile clearly is one, huge possibilities. Automotive, especially two-wheeler automotive, is another, huge possibilities. Pharmaceutical is another, huge possibilities. Global capability centers and software is another, huge possibilities. But overall, at an aggregate level for world trade as a whole, growth will slow down. And trade as a proportion of world GDP, which was close to 25 or 30%, that may probably decline in the next couple of years because it's simply going to become more difficult to trade. And from a marketing perspective, therefore, what should Indian companies be doing? They should be going out and selling. This is the time to go out and sell. And companies that I know in the textile arena, in the uh, automotive arena, in the pharmaceutical arena, they are working hard to try and take advantage of this. They are going out and selling. Of course, the sales pitch is going to need to be more aggressive, needs to be more nuanced, but it is quite possible for India to come out ahead in this particular situation, given what has already happened over here. The one place where we need to be very, very careful is in agriculture. I have kind of talked about agriculture earlier. The US, for example, is seeking reduction in tariffs on agricultural exports, soybeans, wheat, dairy products, and poultry, which are coming in from the US. So soybeans and beef probably don't matter that much. We are not a very large beef eating country, and so neither do we produce or consume soybeans to that level. But poultry and wheat can be a problem. We produce like 120 million tons of wheat, and it is subsidized to some extent. If we lose even 10% or 20% of that because the US is exporting wheat to us, we have a problem. So how we manage that is going to be very, very important, that agriculture and dairy products part. In electronics, the US wants tariffs on lower tariffs over there. And for many products that we are importing, our tariff rates vary, can be as high as 20%. So that's going to need reduction. And in automotive parts, we will need to bring down the tariff levels from 60% or more on fully assembled vehicles to around 15% or less. Auto parts are currently taxed at 7.5 to 15%. That should come down to around 5%. On electronics, the tariffs that we put on goods that we import vary from 5 to 20%. These will probably need to come down to between 3 and 5%. So there's a whole bunch of areas where we will need to bring down the tariffs. But even after that, I think we should be okay. It in many ways, I think will become a little bit more competitive. The companies which are more efficient will do better. The ones which are less efficient will struggle. But in a sense, you want your companies to be world class. You want your companies to be able to compete with the best in the world. So to me, net, it should be a positive going forward for many good Indian companies. The ones which are not focused on quality will definitely struggle. But then, in my view, focusing on quality is critical. If we don't focus on quality, then what are we doing? Uh, I have argued this in different areas, including in education, right? Quality higher education for me is really, really important in India, because if we don't increase the quality of education at scale, it's not as if we don't have some good quality educational institutions, the IITs, IIMs, MDI, Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Ashoka University. All of these are quality institutions, but we need at least 5 times more. And scaling quality in education is not easy. Which is why I sometimes feel very surprised when people get all worked up, so and so university is coming to India. Actually, if you look at the universities which are coming to India, and they're not the top universities, they're second tier or third tier, because it's very difficult to scale education as a product at a geographical distance. At least it has been so far. So let's see what happens. So let me again pause there, and I hope I have been able to kind of give a reasonable response to your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Sai. Professor Sai, my last question. How should firms rethink their pricing strategies in market affected by new or fluctuating tariffs?
That is $1 million question. Um, One has to build models to be able to come to some predictions on what the likely tariff levels are going to be. One needs to prepare for and have some objectives on, this is the profits that I am still okay with, given that I want to maintain a certain market share in a particular market. So if, for example, an apparel making company is very clear in their minds that they want to triple their exports into the US or UK after the change in the tariffs, then I need to be prepared to sacrifice a little bit on the margin. Uh, Once the FTAs are in place, by the way, if you have the FTA in place, then you get some predictability. So for India, the uncertainty right now is mainly with respect to the US and to some extent the European Union. For China, it is not about exports, it is what they choose to dump into our country at low prices. So that's a different challenge altogether, right? So the predictability for the US becomes the most important, because that's our largest export market, right? $150 billion worth of goods out of the $400 billion that we export, almost 35% of our exports. And to the extent that we are able to come to a deal in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we will be protected from much of the uncertainty. If we are not, then we need to plan for scenarios. Um, what would I do if I were looking at the negotiations which are going on? I would construct, the optimistic scenario, the realistic scenario, and the pessimistic scenario. What is the optimistic scenario? That we are able to actually, in different areas, get the tariff levels that we think we can live with, that still allow us to make some profits and gain market share in the US in different areas, while allowing some US goods. I don't mind if Harley Davidson tariffs go down to zero. I mean, how many people can afford Harley Davidsons in this country? One Harley Davidson bike costs you like 5 lakh or 6 lakh rupees. For a 5 lakh or 6 lakh rupees, you can actually get a car, right? So the number of people who can afford Harley Davidsons is limited. It hardly matters whether or not I have a tariff on that. So let's give it to them. And in return, allow me to export smaller bikes or some other things. So if we play our cards right, I think our pricing challenge will resolve itself to a large extent automatically. That deal is important. Uh, Even if the deal does not happen, the signs are that the current US administration has also understood that there is a limit to what they can do on the tariff front before they start disrupting their own markets. And one instance occurred about a month ago when the bond market started to get higher and higher interest rates, and beyond a certain level, if the interest rates to go too high in the bond markets, the US itself is going to have a massive problem, right? So in a sense, there is a self-correcting mechanism in place that limits the level of variability that is possible on the tariffs and therefore the prices. So I would figure out what those limits are and then work to have some alternative uh, mechanisms and alternative price levels that I can roll out depending on which scenario plays out. So that's how I would approach the issue. It will be a little bit more difficult in some industries compared to others. For textiles, I think it's going to be relatively easier. For pharmaceuticals, probably a little more tougher. For automotives, also a little more tougher. For service exports, I don't think it's an issue at all. So depending on the sector, one would need to take a call.
Thank you, Professor Arvind Sahay, for sharing your invaluable insights on tariff, trade and tension, how global firms should rethink marketing and exports. Your deep expertise and research have shed light on the complex challenges and strategic responses that global firms and particularly Indian industries must consider in today's evolving trend landscape. We are grateful for your time and thoughtful perspective, which will surely help our listeners better understand how to navigate the shifting tides of international trade, marketing, and export strategies. Thank you once again, Professor Sai, for being with us.
Thank you, Deepak, very much for the opportunity. It was a pleasure at all, as always.
Thank you.